Okay. So, chapter 1179 just happened. And I know. Everyone's talking about the design, everyone's talking about what Emu looks like right now, and honestly, fair. Like, that is completely fair, because what we got is absolutely insane. It's one of the most terrifying and awe-inspiring villain reveals in the history of shonen manga. Full stop, not an exaggeration. That is just what it is. And I will 100% be going deep into all of it today. But here's the thing, right? Here's the thing that's been eating at me ever since this chapter dropped, and I don't think anybody is actually talking about it properly. And that thing is this. Oda didn't just reveal Emu in chapter 1179, he reminded us. And I know that sounds like a crazy thing to say. I know that sounds like one of those things that people say after a big reveal to make themselves sound smart. Like, oh yeah, I totally knew that was coming, definitely, 100% saw that. But stick with me here, okay? Because this is not that. This is not me retroactively claiming I predicted something. This is me pulling out the actual receipts, the visual receipts, the design receipts, the chapter numbered, panel specific, this is in the manga right now receipts. Because Oda planted every single element of Imu's true form across hundreds and hundreds of chapters spanning the entire series. The white hair, the dark skin, the curved horns, the ringed eyes, the awakened clouds, the wings, all of it. Every piece of what we see in chapter 1179 was hiding somewhere in this series for years, decades in some cases. And the absolute wildest part is that when you see the connections laid out one by one, you don't feel smart for noticing them. You feel a little bit stupid for missing them. Because they were right there. They were right there in front of us the whole time. So that's what today's video is. This is not a reaction. This is not a hype video about how cool Emu looks, although he does look incredibly cool. And we are going to talk about it. This is an investigation. This is the full forensic breakdown of every piece of foreshadowing, every design breadcrumb, every deliberate visual callback that Oda scattered across the series leading to this reveal. This is Anime Autopsy, and today we're doing the autopsy on the mystery that One Piece has been hiding since 1999. Because here's the thing, right? When people say Oda plans everything, most of the time that's kind of just a fan cope, like, oh, he definitely planned that. Definitely, he's a genius. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it is absolutely a retroactive fan cope. But this is one of the cases where you can actually prove it. Where you can sit down with chapter numbers and panel compositions and specific visual design elements and show the receipts chapter by chapter. And that's what we're doing today, so buckle in. Get your favorite drink or snack or whatever you usually do before a long video, because we have a lot of ground to cover and every single piece of it is genuinely fascinating. Let's start at the beginning. June 4th, 2018, chapter 906. For the first time in One Piece history, Oda showed us the true ruler of the world, the person above the five elders, the person above the world nobles, the person that even the Gorosei kneel before, and he showed us almost nothing. A shadow, a crown, a pair of red eyes with these perfect concentric rings around the pupils. That was it. That was genuinely all we got. And I remember reading that chapter for the first time and just losing my mind a little bit, right? Because the implications of that reveal were staggering even with zero actual information about the person. Someone sits on the empty throne. Someone has been ruling this world from behind the curtain the entire time. And Oda, being the absolute master of dramatic withholding that he is, gave us just enough to establish the presence while telling us nothing about the nature. Chapter 9. 108. Silhouette again. But now we see them on the empty throne itself, and we see Imu holding what appear to be pictures of certain people, including a young girl we'll come to recognize as Vivi, including Blackbeard, including Luffy. This chapter adds the dimension of danger. This isn't just a mysterious ruler sitting in the dark. This is someone who is actively identifying people, marking them, already operating on a level completely above the five elders. Then chapter 1060, the destruction of Lulusia Kingdom. And this is actually really important to come back to because Chapter 1060 is where we got our first real demonstration of Imu's raw power. Lulusia Kingdom. Gone. Just erased. From the sky, something descended, and in moments, an entire island with its entire population ceased to exist. No explanation, no build-up, no warning. Just gone. And at the time, most fans assumed this was Uranus, the ancient weapon. That seemed like the most logical explanation, and it might still be true. But the implications of Chapter 1179 complicate that in really interesting ways that we're going to get into later. Chapter 1085. Now this is the chapter that, looking back, gave us so much more than we realized at the time. Because Chapter 1085 is when Cobra gets killed. And it's when Sabo witnesses what Imu actually does to Cobra. And in those panels, Oda showed us a monster silhouette that was clearly very different from the humanoid shadow we'd seen before. It had a tail. It had what appeared to be wings. It had protrusions from the head. It was monstrous in a way that the earlier silhouettes weren't. And the fandom kind of freaked out about it, but then moved on, because silhouettes in One Piece are famously unreliable, right? Like Oda has a history of silhouettes not perfectly matching the final design. But we'll come back to that, because Chapter 1085's silhouette is actually one of the most important chapters in this entire analysis. Then Chapter 1110, March 2024. The five elders transform at the same time, and we see all five of their awakened Zoan forms for the first time, and the internet explodes, and people start doing deep dives on the yokai inspirations and the mythological connections, and this channel definitely covered all of that. But what people missed, what I think even the most dedicated fans missed, is that Chapter 1110 was also one of the biggest pieces of Imu foreshadowing in the entire series. The clouds around the five elders, the nature of their power, the way their transformations worked, all of it was pointing straight at Imu. And again, we'll get to that. And then April 2026. Chapter 1179, Saint Nerona Imu, King of the World, Creator of the World Government, one of the original 20, full reveal. And it was exactly as terrifying as 8 years of build-up deserved. But here's the timeline that really matters. Here's the thing that actually blew my mind when I started putting this analysis together. It's not the timeline of when Imu appeared. It's the timeline of when Oda was planting the design elements that would become Imu. Chapter 50, July 1999. Dracule Mihawk makes his debut. And Mihawk has those eyes, you know the ones. Those red, ringed, concentric circle eyes that are so distinctive they literally become his entire epithet. Hawk eyes. Dracule Mihawk, the man with hawk eyes. Chapter 50, 1999. And Imu has the same eyes. The exact same concentric ring pattern around the pupils. Chapter 9, 106 is when we first see them clearly. That's 856 chapters apart, almost 19 years. And they have the exact same eye design. That's not coincidence. That's not Oda running out of eye designs. That's a deliberate choice that I think is going to matter enormously before this story ends. And we are going to dissect it completely today. Chapter 9, 120, October 2018. King makes his first appearance as part of the Beast Pirates. And King is a Lunarian. And King has black wings and white hair and dark skin and flames. And Chapter 1. 1179 showed us Imu, with white hair and dark skin and wings. Chapter 920 came 4 months after Imu's first silhouette. And yet Oda was already building the design language that Imu would eventually inherit. Chapter 1035. December 2021. Zoro cuts off King's mask. And we finally see what a Lunarian actually looks like. White hair, dark skin, tattoo near the eye. And if you pull up that panel of King's face right next to Imu's face in Chapter 1179, The similarities are so precise and so specific that there is no way to argue it's coincidence. We'll do that exact comparison later. This is what I mean when I say Oda was reminding us. Because all of this information was in the series. All of it was accessible. We were just reading the individual chapters without seeing how they fit together into a picture that was always pointing at one person. So, before we get into the actual evidence, I want to be really clear about something. I want to establish what counts as actual foreshadowing in this video. Because I think it's really easy for these kinds of analyses to get sloppy and start counting things that are just coincidences or vague thematic resonances as if they're the same as genuinely specific planted visual evidence. And they're not. I'm not going to do that to you. So here's the standard I'm holding myself to in this video. For something to count as genuine foreshadowing of Imu's true form in this video, it needs to meet at least one of three criteria. Visual confirmation. Oda drew a specific design element that matches something we see in Imu's Chapter 1179 reveal. Not a vague resemblance. A specific identifiable visual element. Same eye pattern, same horn shape, same wing type, that kind of specific. Textual confirmation. Characters or narration within the manga reference traits, powers, or historical facts that directly connect to what Imu is revealed to be. Canon dialogue that in retrospect was literally describing Imu, structural confirmation, story patterns that only make sense in retrospect, setup and payoff structures that are clearly intentional when you look at how Oda spaced them across the narrative. If something doesn't meet at least one of those three criteria, it's not going on our list. We are holding the line here. This is not a speculation video. This is an evidence video, and there's a difference. Alright, with that established, let's actually get into the evidence. And I want to start with something that I think gets overlooked a lot, which is the silhouettes themselves. Because when most people talk about Oda withholding Imu's design, they frame it as Oda hiding information. But that's not exactly right. What Oda was doing is more precise than that. He was revealing specific things while hiding others. And if you look at the silhouettes carefully, he was incredibly deliberate about which details were visible and which weren't. And the things he chose to show us are fascinating. Let's go back to chapter 906, the very first Imu silhouette, and look at it carefully. Yes, Imu is in shadow. Yes, you can't see their face, but Oda still gave us concrete information. First, the crown. And this isn't some small decorative crown. This is a massive, three-pointed crown that suggests a level of authority that goes beyond anything we've seen in the world government. The shape is almost religious, almost papal. It screams the divine right of kings in a way that no mere world noble would wear. And then the eyes. Even in full silhouette, Oda drew Imu's eyes with total clarity. Those concentric rings, those precise circles within circles. Oda went out of his way to make them visible in shadow. And that's the tell right there. Because that's not what you do if you're just drawing a mysterious figure. That's what you do if you have a specific reason for those eyes to be identifiable. He wanted you to see them. He wanted you to remember them, even if you didn't understand why yet. And then there's the scale. Because chapter 906 also shows us something incredibly important that almost nobody paid attention to at the time. Imu walks into a frozen chamber, and in that chamber, there is a giant straw hat. And when you look at the size relationship between Imu and the hat, Imu reads as human-sized or close to it, which tells us something. At the time of chapter 906, Imu is presenting as a roughly human-sized figure. The monster form, the ancient giant horns, the massive awakened form we see in chapter 1179. That's not what Imu is walking around as in their default state. Oda was already planting the idea that there's a difference between Imu's contained form and Imu's actual power state. Now let's jump to chapter 1085. Because this is the one that really breaks things open in hindsight. Chapter 1085 is when Cobra is killed, and it's when Sabo witnesses the kill, And this is the chapter where Imu's monster silhouette appears for the first time. And if you go back and look at it now, knowing what chapter 1179 revealed, you realize that Oda drew the monster form. He drew it. Right there. In 2023, he just kept it in shadow. The tail is visible. Imu uses a long pointed tail to stab Cobra, and that same tail is visible in chapter 1179. The wing-like shapes extending from Imu's back are visible, and chapter 1179 confirmed those as black wings. The head protrusions, the horns, are there if you look for the silhouette shape, and then the floating wisps around the figure. The things that people sort of half noticed but didn't quite know what to make of. Those are the Hagoromo clouds, the awakened Zoan clouds. Already there in 2023, already drawn by Oda. Just waiting for us to understand what we were looking at. And here's the thing that really gets me about chapter 1085 specifically, right? We had a debate in the fandom for a long time about whether Imu's silhouette forms were canonical depictions, or whether they were just Oda drawing loosely in the way he sometimes does with characters before he fully settles their design. And now we know. Chapter 1. 1179 shows us Imu physically transforming from the contained humanoid form into the monster form. We literally see the transformation happen, which means the silhouettes were not Oda drawing loosely. The silhouettes were Oda drawing accurately. The shadow form and the monster form are both real. They're both Imu. And chapter 1085 showed us the monster form 3 years before we understood what we were looking at. That is planning. That is what genuine long-term planning looks like. That's not a coincidence or a happy accident. Oda knew in 2023 what Imu's transformed state looked like, because he'd already designed it, and he put it in the manga in shadow because the full reveal wasn't ready yet, but the groundwork needed to be laid. And now look at what the silhouettes were telling us, right? If you'd gone to the fandom in 2023 after chapter 1085 and said, okay, based on the silhouette, what ancient races does this monster remind you of? You would have gotten 3 answers. Wings, like the Lunarians. Horns like that, curved and prominent, like Kaido and the ancient giants, and floating awakened clouds like the Zoan users we'd been seeing in the Egghead arc. All 3 of those connections were visually available in 2023 from a silhouette, and all 3 of them were confirmed in chapter 1179 as genuine elements of Imu's design. We had the answer in shadow. We just didn't know how to read it. Alright? So that's the framework. That's the foundation. Now let's actually get into the design itself, piece by piece. And I want to start with the connection that I think is the most visually undeniable, the most specific, and the one that most clearly demonstrates that Oda was planting Imu's design deliberately years before the reveal. I want to start with King, because King might be the single biggest piece of Imu foreshadowing in the entire series. I want you to actually stop for a second and think about the King situation from a narrative perspective. King was introduced in chapter 920 in October 2018, 4 months after Imu's first silhouette in chapter 906. King was introduced as part of the Beast Pirates, as one of Kaido's 3 calamities, the strongest of the 3. And at introduction, King is masked. Completely masked. We can see the black wings, we can see the flames, we can see the enormous size, but not the face. And then chapter 1035 happens. December 2021, and Zoro cuts King's mask off, and we see a Lunarian face for the first time. White hair, long flowing, silver white hair, dark skin. A tattoo on the left side of the face near the eye. And those are the Lunarian racial traits. That's what a Lunarian looks like. Chapter 1. 1035 established it definitively. Now pull up chapter 1, 1179, and look at Imu. White hair, long flowing silver white hair, dark skin, tattoo on the left side of the face. The similarities are not vague, they're not thematic, they're specific and precise. Same hair color and length and texture, same skin tone, same tattoo placement on the same side of the face. Oda gave us Imu's appearance through King 3 years before the actual reveal. He just made sure we were looking at the subordinate instead of the boss. And okay, yes, I can already hear the response, right? I can already hear people saying, well, obviously they're similar because they're both Lunarians, that's just what Lunarians look like. And to that I say, sure, but then let me ask you a question. Why did Oda design the Lunarian racial features to look exactly like Imu? Which came first? Did Oda design what Lunarians look like and then decide Imu would be a Lunarian? Or did Oda design Imu first and then build the Lunarian race to match? Because either way, the visual similarity is completely deliberate. Either way, Oda was creating a specific visual language that pointed toward the eventual Imu reveal. The foreshadowing was intentional, regardless of which order the creative decisions were made in. But let me push this even further. Because the connection between Imu and the Lunarians isn't just visual. It goes deeper than appearance, and this is where the canon lore that Oda gave us becomes really important. Chapter 1, 1022. Marco makes this offhand comment during the Onigashima fight, and Marco, being the guy he is, seems like he's just providing contextual information about King. But he says something that, in hindsight, should have sent alarm bells ringing for everyone. He says that he heard there was once a race that lived on top of the Red Line, a race that could create flames, a race so powerful that they were called gods. The kingdom of the gods on the Red Line. And that race was hunted to near extinction by the world government. Now let's sit with that for a second. The Lunarians were called gods. They lived on top of the Red Line, the exact same Red Line where Mary Geoise, the Holy Land, now sits. And they were hunted to near extinction by the world government. The world government that Imu created. The world government that Imu has ruled for 800 years. The world government that still offers 100 million berries for information leading to the identification of a Lunarian. So on one hand, the world government is aggressively hunting down the survivors of the Lunarian race. Right? They want them dead. They've been trying to erase them for 800 years. And on the other hand, Imu, the supreme ruler of the world government, has Lunarian features, Lunarian physical traits, the same racial characteristics that the world government has been trying to wipe from the face of the earth. That's a massive contradiction. That's one of those contradictions that Oda plants specifically to be paid off later. And the most logical explanation, the one that everything in the narrative seems to be pointing toward, is that Imu isn't just a Lunarian. Imu might be the Lunarian who betrayed the rest of his race, the one who helped the world government destroy the kingdom of the gods that used to sit on the Red Line, and in doing so, took that throne for himself, used the world government to exterminate his own people so no one else could claim the divine authority he'd stolen. Which, honestly, that's a horrifying backstory. That's one of the most villainous origin stories I've ever heard. And it explains so much about why the world government hunts Lunarians with such single-minded ferocity. Because Imu can't have survivors. Because survivors are proof of what he used to be and what he did. King surviving, just one Lunarian still alive in the world, is an existential threat to the entire mythology Imu has built around himself. And then there are the wings. Because here's one more piece of the Lunarian puzzle that Chapter 1, 1179 gave us, and I think deserves a lot more attention than it's getting. When Imu's awakened monster form is revealed, the wings are there. Black wings, matching King's wings in color and general shape. But here's the difference. King's wings are feathered. They're structured like a bird's wings, like an angel's wings. And Imu's wings in the awakened form, look at them. They're different. They're more bat-like, more jagged, more demonic. And that difference isn't random, right? Oda doesn't do that by accident. Oda is telling us something with that visual contrast. King's wings are the original Lunarian wings. The angelic version. The wings that the race that was called gods would have had. And Imu's wings look like what happens to those wings after 800 years of being something monstrous. The wings of a fallen god, the wings of something that used to be divine and chose to become demonic. Light versus dark, angel versus devil. And Oda set up that entire contrast by making King the visual template for the Lunarian appearance, so that when we finally saw Imu, we would have exactly the right reference point to understand the magnitude of the corruption. Without King, we don't know what a Lunarian is supposed to look like. Without that baseline, Imu's design doesn't carry the same weight. King was necessary for Imu's reveal to land correctly. That's not a coincidence. That's architecture. Alright, so that's the Lunarian connection. But here's where it gets really interesting, because Imu's design doesn't just point to one ancient race. If you look at chapter 1179 carefully, Imu is pulling from multiple bloodlines simultaneously. And the second major one is even older and more specific than the Lunarian connection. The horns. Look at Imu's horns in chapter 1179. Really look at them. They curve twice. They go up, and then they curl, and then they curve again in the opposite direction, forming this double curve shape that's almost like the letter S on each side. And that specific shape, that double curve, is unique. There's no other character in One Piece with horns exactly like that. But here's the thing. There are characters whose horns give you a specific part of that design. And when you put them together, you get Imu. Let's start with Kaido. Chapter 795. October 2015. Kaido's first appearance. And Kaido is an enormous figure with two curved horns, and he refers to himself as an Oni. Not a human, not a giant. An Oni, a demon. And the way he says it isn't just a nickname or a title. It's a racial identifier. It's what he is, and his horns are one of the primary visual markers of that. They're large, they curve in one direction, and they're clearly distinct from the horns of, say, a Minotaur or a standard devil fruit transform. Then Yamato also refers to herself as an Oni, inheriting the trait from Kaido. Confirms that there's a specific racial bloodline here, that Oni isn't just a title. It's a genetic heritage that passes down specific physical traits, including the horns. And then the ancient giants, Oars, Oars Jr., the massive demonic-looking giants with enormous horns who predate the current giant species and have this more monstrous appearance compared to, say, Dory and Brogy. And then the Elbaf arc started properly confirming what a lot of fans suspected, that ancient giant blood and Oni blood are connected, that the horned characters across the series are all drawing from the same ancient genetic lineage, that there's a through line connecting Kaido's self-identification as Oni, the ancient giant's distinctive appearance, and whatever the original source of that bloodline was. And now we have Imu, with horns that curve twice, with an S-shaped double curve, which is more elaborate than Kaido's, more complex, which in One Piece's visual language typically means older, more original, more powerful. Like if Kaido's horns are one generation away from the source, Imu's horns are the source. Let me say that again because I think it's important. Kaido considered himself the world's strongest creature and was arguably the most terrifying physical fighter we've seen in One Piece outside of the very top tier. And his horns suggest ancient giant or Oni bloodline. Imu has horns that are visually more elaborate, more complex, and more exaggerated than Kaido's. Which in Oda's design language is saying something very specific. It's saying that whatever Kaido was, Imu is the older version of it, the original version, the one that the rest of the bloodline traces back to. Think about what that means for the story. Kaido spending his entire life looking for a fight worth dying in. Kaido being essentially unkillable through most of the series. And then there's someone walking around with even older, even more elaborate versions of those physical traits. Someone who has been alive for 800 years. Someone whose presence alone transforms the environment around him. If Kaido was the most dangerous person in the world in his era, and Imu is the original source of whatever made Kaido what he was, then the scale of what Luffy is eventually going to have to fight is genuinely staggering. Now, the S-shape specifically. Because I want to spend a minute on this because I think Oda chose that shape very deliberately, right? And there are a few different directions you can take the interpretation. The most obvious one is the serpent, S for serpent. Imu also has a serpent-like tail, and the devil imagery that runs through his entire design maps very naturally onto the biblical serpent in the Garden of Eden. The one who offered the forbidden fruit, the one who was cast out of paradise, the one who became the embodiment of temptation and corruption. And if Imu is somehow the original source of devil fruits, which is a theory that I find incredibly compelling, and which we will definitely be addressing in another video very soon, then the serpent connection is almost too perfect. The serpent who brought the forbidden fruit into the world. But then there's also the saint connection. S for saint. Saint Nerona Imu. His full official title. And there's something deeply ironic about a figure who looks like everything we associate with demonic imagery, carrying the title of saint, of holy person, of someone blessed and sanctified. It's the same kind of sacred versus profane contradiction that runs through the entire world government's mythology. These people who call themselves celestial dragons, who claim divine authority, who style themselves as the closest thing to gods in this world. And at the top of all of it is something that looks like the embodiment of evil wearing the clothes of divinity. The S-horns as a mockery of the saint's crown. And then, of course, there's the most literal reading, S for sovereign, the king of the world. And in that reading, the horns aren't demonic. They're a crown. The most ancient, most powerful crown imaginable. The crown of someone who has been ruling this world for 800 years and watched every human king and noble and emperor rise and fall while he remained. I genuinely don't know which of those interpretations Oda intended. I think he might have intended all three simultaneously, because that's the kind of layered, symbolic design he tends to go for at this level of the story. But I do know that the S shape is deliberate. It's unique in the series. And it marks Imu as distinct from every other horned character in a way that's saying specifically that Imu is older and more original than all of them. Now, before we leave the ancient giant and Oni connection entirely, I want to note something that I think is going to become more important as the Elbaf arc develops. We're literally in Elbaf right now. Imu just arrived in Elbaf. And the Elbaf arc is the arc that was set up from the very beginning of the series as the home of the giants, the place that Dory and Brogy were fighting to get back to, the place that Usopp promised he'd visit, the place that has been on the horizon of One Piece's endgame since literally the Little Garden arc. And what is Elbaf? It's the island of giants with a connection to ancient giants, with a mythology centered on Na, the sun god, with a specific cultural heritage that connects to the Void Century and Joy Boy and all of the deepest lore in the series. And Imu just showed up there with the most elaborate version of the ancient giant horn design we've ever seen. That's not random, that's Oda positioning the final confrontation between Imu and everything that Elbaf represents. And it's going to involve those horns in a way that connects back to every horned character we've seen in this series. Alright, let's talk about the eyes, because the ringed eyes are, in my opinion, the most cryptic piece of foreshadowing in this entire analysis. And I think they're pointing at something that we still don't fully understand. Something that goes beyond just Imu being a Lunarian or having ancient giant blood. Something that might be one of the core mysteries at the heart of the series. Let's start with the most obvious connection, the one most people know about. Chapter 50. July 1999. Dracule Mihawk. Hawk eyes. The world's greatest swordsman. A Mihawk has those eyes. Those distinctive red irises with the concentric rings. The specific multiple ring pattern around the pupils that became his entire visual identity. His entire nickname. The thing that everyone associates with Mihawk on a first read. And then jump to chapter 906. June 2018. Imu's first appearance. And even in full silhouette with nothing else visible, Oda drew the eyes clearly. Red irises, concentric rings, the exact same pattern. And this is important, right? This is not a subtle echo or a vague stylistic similarity. This is Oda using the same specific eye design, the same pattern he gave to Mihawk in 1999, the same pattern that is so distinctive it became Mihawk's entire identity. He used it again in 2018 for the most important villain in the series, and then confirmed it in the full reveal in Chapter 1179. 856 chapters apart, nearly 19 years, same eye design. Now, the easy explanation is that Oda just likes this eye design and used it twice. And I would accept that explanation except for two problems. First, Mihawk isn't the only other character with this specific pattern. And second, the other characters who have it form a really interesting grouping when you look at them together. The second character is Zunesha, Chapter 821. The ancient elephant that carries the island of Zu on its back. One of the oldest living creatures in the series. A being that has been walking the seas for over 1,000 years. A being that knew Joy Boy personally. A being that has been carrying a punishment for 1,000 years, sentenced to walk the seas and never stop. And Zunesha has the concentric ring eye pattern. Different color, turquoise instead of red, but unmistakably the same structural design. Circles within circles around the pupil. Now, why does an ancient elephant have the same eye pattern as the world's greatest swordsman? That's a weird connection, right? On the surface, that seems like three completely unrelated things. An ancient cursed elephant, a human swordsman, and the king of the world. What do these things have in common? And here's where it gets really interesting to me. Because I was thinking about this, right? I was thinking about what else we know about Zunesha and Mihawk beyond their eye design. And I noticed something. Zunesha has the ability to project visions. When Zunesha was about to attack Jack's fleet, Momonosuke received a vision through some form of telepathic connection. He saw what Zunesha was seeing. He experienced Zunesha's perspective directly. And that vision projection happened through the eyes. Through whatever it is that makes Zunesha's eyes work the way they do. And now think about the scene at Marineford. Mihawk is watching the battle. And he sees Luffy. And for a moment, one of the most tense moments in that arc, Mihawk evaluates Luffy. Looks at him. And Luffy somehow gets the sense of what Mihawk sees. The sense of being truly observed by someone operating on a completely different level. It's not the same as the Zunesha vision, but it's in the same territory. It's the eyes doing something that goes beyond normal observation. And then there's the third character, Hakuba. Cavendish's alter ego, the violent sleeping personality that takes over when Cavendish falls asleep. And when Hakuba emerges, Cavendish's left eye changes. It shifts to show the concentric ring pattern. The same pattern, and Hakuba is described by everyone who encounters him as a demon personality. A separate entity that inhabits Cavendish's body. A possessed version of the person. So let's lay out what we have, right? We have Emu, who has the ringed eyes and is the supreme ruler of the world, who has been alive for 800 years and may be something genuinely supernatural. We have Zunesha, who has the ringed eyes and is an ancient being over 1,000 years old who was punished by someone from the Void Century and has a direct connection to Joy Boy. We have Mihawk, who has the ringed eyes and is the world's greatest swordsman, who carries an unusual family name that references the devil and whose true nature and history are mysterious. And we have Hakuba, who has the ringed eye in demon possession mode and who is described as a demonic entity, ancient beings, supernatural connections, void century ties, demonic associations. Those aren't random groupings. Oda is putting these characters in the same visual category for a reason. The ringed eye design is a marker of something, a specific quality or power or history that these characters share. And I genuinely think that before this story ends, we're going to understand what that quality is. And it's going to reframe Mihawk in a way that's going to be very surprising. Because here's the Mihawk theory that I find most compelling. What if the ringed eyes are connected to the Void Century? What if they're a mark of beings who have a direct connection to the events of the Void Century, either by being alive during it or by carrying some form of power that originated in it? Zunesha was there, Emu was there, both have the ringed eyes. If Mihawk has some kind of connection to that era, some kind of heritage or bloodline or power that traces back to the Void Century, the ringed eyes would make perfect sense as a marker of that connection. I'm not saying Mihawk is 800 years old. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that the eye design Oda gave him in Chapter 50 is the same design he later gave to the King of the World, who has been alive for 800 years, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think Oda knew what he was doing when he drew those eyes. I think he planted something in Mihawk's design in 1999 that is going to matter before One Piece ends. And I think Dracul, the clan name, the son of the dragon, son of the devil, is going to factor into it in a way that connects to Imu's story more directly than we currently understand. Alright, let's talk about the Five Elders. Because Chapter 1110 is a chapter I want to spend a serious amount of time on, because I think it contains more Imu foreshadowing than almost any other chapter in the series. And most of it is hidden in the details of how the Five Elders' powers work. Chapter 1, 1110. March 2024. All five of the Gorosei transform simultaneously at Egghead, and we get the full visual reveal of their awakened forms. Saturn becomes the Gyuki, the Ushioni, the ox spider demon of Japanese mythology. Mars becomes the Itsumaid, the bird demon. Walkeri takes the Fengshi form, the giant demonic boar. Nushjuro becomes the Bekotsu, the skeletal horse. And Jupiter becomes the massive sandworm, drawing from desert mythology. All five of them. All five at once. And the fandom exploded, right? Because these are incredible designs and the yokai connections are deep and interesting and there's a ton to analyze. And everyone started analyzing the yokai connections, which is totally valid and important. But here's what I think people missed. Look at the clouds around the Five Elders' awakened forms, the Hagoromo clouds, the black, swirling awakened Zoan clouds. Every single one of them has it. Every single one of the Five Elders in their awakened form is surrounded by those characteristic black clouds of awakened Zoan users. Now compare that to Lucci. Compare it to Luffy's Gear 5. Every awakened Zoan user we've seen has these Hagoromo clouds. They're a visual indicator of awakening. They're consistent across all the awakened users we've seen. And here's what's critical. None of those clouds have eyes in them. Not Lucci's, not Luffy's, not the Five Elders. The awakened Zoan clouds are just clouds. And then Chapter 1, 1179 shows us Imu's awakened form. And the clouds have eyes. Multiple eyes embedded directly in the clouds themselves. Looking outward in every direction. Like the Ophanim, right? Like the biblically accurate angels, the wheels within wheels covered in eyes. Or like certain iterations of Shiva or Brahma in Hindu imagery. The all-seeing divine presence manifested as a being that observes everything simultaneously. That visual distinction between Imu's clouds and every other awakened user's clouds is, I think, one of the most important design decisions in Chapter 1179. Because it's doing something very specific. It's saying that Imu is not just another awakened Zoan user. The Five Elders are awakened Zoan users. Lucci is an awakened Zoan user. Imu is something different, something beyond, something that the awakened state as we understand it doesn't quite contain. And I think when you put that together with Saturn's death, with what Chapter 1179 showed us about how Imu treated one of the Five Elders, the picture becomes really clear. Let me talk about Saturn's death for a second, because it's one of the most important scenes in Chapter 1179, and I don't think enough people are fully processing what it means. After failing at Egghead, Saturn is summoned to Imu's presence, and Imu strips Saturn of his power, takes it back, removes the awakened form, and then kills him. Let's think about what that means. Imu can give powers, and Imu can take them back. The Five Elders are not independent devil fruit users who happen to find particularly powerful fruits. They're subordinates who were granted power by Imu, and that power can be revoked, at will, without warning. One of the 5 elders who had fought the entire Straw Hat crew at Egghead and demonstrated what seemed like absolute regenerative immortality was stripped of everything and killed by Imu without apparent effort. Now look back at chapter 1110 with that knowledge. The 5 elders all have the same type of clouds, the same style of regeneration. They all arrived through the same magic circle. Their introduction boxes when they first transformed didn't give devil fruit names, just the yokai names. At the time, people wondered about the naming thing. Oda almost always gives devil fruit names in transformation introduction boxes. Why didn't he here? And the answer, in retrospect, is that these aren't individual devil fruits. They're expressions of a single power source. Imu's power, parceled out and granted to loyal servants. Chapter 1. 1110 was showing us the product. Chapter 1. 1179 showed us the factory, and the eyes in Imu's clouds versus the absence of eyes in the Elder's clouds. That's the same distinction. The Elders received awakened power from Imu, but Imu's awakening contains something the Elders' versions don't: the all-seeing aspect, the omniscient observer element, the eyes. Because Imu doesn't just have power, Imu is the source of the power. And whatever the eyes in those clouds mean, whether it's literal omniscience or a symbolic representation of absolute control or something we don't fully understand yet, it's the marker that distinguishes the original from the copies. This is what chapter 1110 was building toward. The 5 Elders reveal wasn't just about the 5 Elders. It was about establishing the visual language for Imu's reveal. It was setting the template. Here's what awakened power looks like when it's granted. Here are the clouds. Here's the regeneration. Here's the demon folklore imagery. Now, 14 chapters later, here's what that power looks like at its original source. And the difference is the eyes. Alright, I want to stop here for a second, because if you're enjoying this breakdown, and this is the kind of deep forensic analysis you want to see more of, this would be a fantastic moment to hit that like button. It genuinely does help the video find more people who are into this kind of content. And if you're new here, what we do on this channel is exactly this. We take the biggest mysteries and moments in One Piece and we go deep. Not surface level, not just reacting to what happened, but actually pulling apart the construction to understand how Oda built it. So if that's your thing, subscribing would make a lot of sense right now. Okay. Now let's talk about something that I think is criminally underanalyzed in most discussions of Imu's introduction. The giant straw hat. Go back to chapter 906. Imu enters that frozen chamber, and the first thing we see in that chamber is a giant straw hat. Not a normal-sized straw hat. A giant one, a straw hat so large it could fit on the head of a giant. Stored in a frozen, temperature-controlled vault. Preserved. Like a relic, like something that someone went out of their way to keep safe. Now at the time, the obvious connection was Joy Boy. The straw hat is the symbol most closely associated with Luffy and Roger and Joy Boy. It's the symbolic object that represents the will that passes from person to person. And a giant version of it stored in Mary Geoise under Imu's watch seemed like an obvious connection to Joy Boy in the Void Century. Which, yes, absolutely, that's the right read. But I think the giant straw hat was telling us something more specific than just that Imu knew Joy Boy. Because think about what it means to store something in a frozen, temperature-controlled vault. That's not how you store a trophy. That's not how you store something you want to show off or celebrate. You don't put a war trophy in a climate-controlled preservation chamber. You do that with something you're protecting, something you're maintaining, something that has ongoing significance beyond just being a reminder of a past victory. So why is Imu preserving this hat? Why has Imu been keeping it in exactly that condition for what we now know is 800 years? Because chapter 1, 1179 confirmed what many suspected. Imu is one of the original 20. Imu has been alive since the Void Century. Imu was there when Joy Boy existed. Which means Imu has been preserving that hat for 800 years. Whatever that hat represents, Imu has decided it requires preservation over the course of 8 centuries. The most unsettling theory, and the one I find most compelling, is that Imu knows the straw hat matters. Imu knows that whoever wears it represents the recurrence of Joy Boy, and Imu has been watching for it. For 800 years, Imu has been waiting for someone to appear who carries the same Haki, the same spirit, the same mission as Joy Boy, and storing the hat is part of that. It's Imu maintaining a connection to the one thing that scares him, the one prophecy that threatens everything he's built. And then we get to Chapter 1119, and Luffy unleashes Joy Boy's stored Haki. The Haki burst from the Gear 5 activation at Egghead, and Imu, in Mary Geoise, screams, literally screams, says the name, Joy Boy, and reacts as if in physical pain. That's the most direct evidence in the series of how Imu actually feels about Joy Boy. Not victorious, not dismissive, not indifferent, pained, frightened maybe. At minimum, deeply disturbed by the sensation of that specific Haki. Which means Imu recognized it. And you don't recognize a Haki signature with that kind of visceral, painful reaction unless you felt it before. Unless that exact Haki hurt you before. Unless 800 years ago, Joy Boy was the one person in the world whose power actually threatened you. And the giant straw hat was the first clue. Chapter 9:106. Before we knew anything about Imu's history, before we understood the Void Century connection, before we had any of the lore we have now, Oda put a giant straw hat in that frozen vault, and it was telling us, directly, that Imu's story is the story of someone who has been in the shadow of Joy Boy's legacy for 800 years. Someone who won 800 years ago and has been spending those 8 centuries making sure it stays that way. Someone for whom the drums of liberation, the return of Joy Boy, represents the one true threat that all their power and all their planning was always working to prevent. Now, the size question is interesting, and I want to address it because it's genuinely unresolved, and I think people have strong feelings about it. The hat is enormous. Like, scaled to the scene in Chapter 906, it's almost as tall as the room it's in. And various giants we see in the series are roughly twice human height. So if a normal straw hat fits a human head, this hat would fit someone approximately twice human height at minimum. Which led to theories about Joy Boy being a giant. But here's the thing. Chapter 1. 1122 gave us what appears to be Joy Boy's silhouette during the Void Century flashback. And that silhouette looks roughly human-sized. Not giant-sized. And Oda's relationship with scale in this series is, to put it diplomatically, loose. There are panels where the same character appears to change size depending on what the narrative needs for the composition. So the hat size might not be a precise indicator of Joy Boy's height. It might just be Oda drawing it big to emphasize its significance. But then again, maybe not. Maybe the hat belonged to a giant ally of Joy Boy. Maybe there was an ancient giant who was Joy Boy's companion, whose hat Joy Boy kept, or whose hat came to be associated with Joy Boy's mission. We know that the connection between Joy Boy and the giants has been established through the Elbaf connection, through the fact that we're now in Elbaf, and everything there seems to resonate with Joy Boy's legacy. And ancient giants of enormous stature were present in the Void Century. Oars was around during that era. There's also a third option that I think is genuinely possible. Joy Boy used a devil fruit or a power that could change his size. We know from the road poneglyphs and various pieces of lore that Joy Boy was incredibly powerful and operated on a scale that affected the entire world. If Joy Boy had a size-altering power, the hat belonging to Joy Boy personally, but in his enlarged form would explain everything. It would fit with the mythological narrative of Joy Boy being something genuinely superhuman. And it would fit with the visual impact Oda was clearly going for in Chapter 906, where the size of the hat was meant to immediately signal that this is no ordinary straw hat. This is connected to something on a completely different scale than the human world. Regardless of the specific answer, the giant straw hat's presence in that vault was one of the most important details Oda planted in chapter 906, and everything we've learned since has only deepened its significance. Now I want to talk about something that might seem like a different category of analysis, but is actually connected to everything we've been discussing. I want to talk about names. Because Oda is an absolutely obsessive wordsmith when it comes to naming characters, and their names almost always contain multiple layers of meaning that preview important aspects of who they are. Imu's name. In Japanese, it's written in katakana as this specific configuration. And the interesting thing about this katakana configuration is what it points to linguistically. First reading, I plus mu. In Japanese Buddhist philosophy, mu means void, emptiness, nothingness, the absence of being. And it's not just a word in Buddhism, it's a concept. The void is the fundamental nature of reality in certain Buddhist schools of thought. Everything that appears solid and real is, on a deeper level, mu, nothingness. So Imu literally means something like self of the void, or I am nothingness. And for the ruler of the void century, the person who has been systematically erasing the true history of the world, the person who has been creating literal voids in the historical record for 800 years, that name is perfect. Imu is the void. Imu is the erasure. Imu is the nothingness that takes the place of what was. Second reading. Umi is the Japanese word for sea, ocean, and Imu is umi spelled backwards, reversed, mirror image. And in a series where the sea itself is treated as almost an entity, where the relationship between pirates and the sea is one of the central metaphors, where the sea hates devil fruit users, where the sea god is invoked as an opposing force to the sky and the sun, where the entire concept of freedom and adventure is tied to the open sea. Having the ultimate villain's name be the sea backwards is deeply intentional. Imu is the anti-sea, the reversed ocean, the thing that stands against everything the sea represents in this story. Third reading. This one is a little more meta, and I'll acknowledge it as more of an interpretive reach, but it maps too well to ignore. In English, im as a prefix means not or against. Immortal means not mortal. Immutable means not changeable. Impossible means not possible. And Imu, read phonetically through that English lens, is im plus you, against you, not you, the anti-self, which is exactly what Imu is to Luffy in the narrative, the opposition, the thing that exists in fundamental contrast to everything Luffy is and represents. Oda named this character. Before chapter 906, the name was chosen deliberately, and every one of those readings was available in the text from the moment the name appeared. The void, the reverse sea, the anti-self, all of it was pointing at the character we eventually saw in chapter 1, 1179. And then there's the full title, Saint Nerona Imu. Chapter 1. 1086 gave us the complete name. Nerona. And look, the connection here is pretty obvious, right? Nero, the Roman emperor. The one who was famously associated with the persecution of Christians, with tyrannical excess, with the burning of Rome, with every quality we associate with a ruler who has completely abandoned any moral restraint in the exercise of absolute power. Nero is the archetype of the corrupt emperor who wields divine authority while doing monstrous things. And Nerona is Oda taking that name, giving it a slightly altered form, and attaching it to the person who sits above every ruler, every emperor, every king in the One Piece world. But here's the layer I think is really important. The title is Saint, Saint Nerona Imu. A saint is, by definition, someone who is holy, someone who is elevated above ordinary humanity through virtue and divine connection. The concept of sainthood is fundamentally about being set apart from the corruption of the world through moral and spiritual excellence. And Oda put that title in front of a name that directly references one of history's most notorious tyrants, and then applied the whole thing to a being that visually looks like the embodiment of demonic evil. That's deliberate irony of the highest order. And it's been in the series since Chapter 1086. The name itself was telling us, way before Chapter 1179, that whatever was hiding behind the title of Saint was the exact opposite of what that title implies. The most holy name for the most fundamentally unholy being. The divine authority for the creature that corrupted divinity. That's not an accident. That's Oda being very precise about who this character is. Alright, let me now put this all together in a way that I think is going to hit differently than anything we've covered so far, because we've been talking about Imu's design elements in isolation. The Lunarian stuff, the ancient giant stuff, the eyes, the name. But I want to zoom out and look at what all of these design choices are doing together, right? Because when you see them as a unified whole, the picture that emerges is actually about the final battle, about the collision that this entire series has been building toward. And to do that, I need to talk about Joy Boy. Because Joy Boy and Imu are constructed as mirror images of each other, polar opposites. And the way Oda built that opposition is one of the most impressive pieces of long-form planning in the series. Let's start with the Haki reaction. Chapter 1, 1119. Luffy activates Gear 5. And the Haki that bursts outward isn't just Luffy's Haki, it's Joy Boy's stored Haki. The Haki of the person who was alive 800 years ago and whose will has been sleeping in the Gomu Gomu no Mi, now revealed as the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika all this time. And Imu screams, reacts physically, says the name Joy Boy, is visibly disturbed in a way that looks like pain or fear. Now think about what that means. Imu has been ruling this world for 800 years. Imu has destroyed kingdoms, erased history, killed anyone who threatened the world government's authority. Imu has faced absolutely everything this world has to offer in terms of opposition. And this is the reaction Imu has to a Haki signature from someone who died 8 centuries ago. Not the 5 elders reacting. Imu personally. That specific Haki causing that specific reaction. There's only one way that makes sense. Imu fought Joy Boy. Directly. In the Void Century. And Joy Boy's Haki hurt Imu then, in the actual battle. And 800 years later, feeling that same Haki again triggers the memory of that hurt. Of that close call. Of the one time in 800 years that Imu was genuinely threatened. The giant straw hat was the physical marker of that history. Chapter 906. And Chapter 1. 1119 was the emotional marker. The visceral proof that this isn't ancient history to Imu. This is personal. 800 years later, Joy Boy's Haki is still the one thing that makes Imu scream. And now here's the design opposition that I think is the most brilliant thing Oda has set up. Because Gear 5, right? The drums of liberation. When Luffy activates Gear 5, his heartbeat creates the drums of liberation. That rhythm, that sound. And it represents freedom and joy. It makes things come alive in a playful, wonderful way. The environment responds to Luffy's awakening with this infectious energy of liberation. Things dance, things come to life. But with joy, with freedom, with an energy that feels like the world itself celebrating. And then Chapter 1. 1179. Imu arrives at Elbaf, and the buildings come alive. The structures transform. Evil laughing faces appear on the architecture. The environment responds to Imu's presence and awakening, exactly like how the environment responds to Luffy's Gear 5. The same type of phenomenon. The world coming alive in response to a supreme will, a divine awakening, but with horror instead of joy. With oppression instead of liberation, with darkness instead of light, with twisted faces instead of playful ones. Oda named it, the drums of oppression, the direct counter to the drums of liberation. And these aren't just thematic labels, right? These are two sides of the same power, operating at the absolute highest level. Two divine wills expressing themselves through the same mechanism, the transformation of the environment through awakened power, but in diametrically opposite ways. Liberation versus oppression. Joy versus fear, sun versus abyss, white clouds versus black clouds with eyes, and then there's the visual design opposition that Oda has built between them. Luffy in Gear 5 has white hair, white clouds, a bright, sunny visual palette that suggests the sun god Nika, freedom made visible. Imu has white hair too, but dark skin and black clouds with eyes and demonic imagery. The same starting point, the white hair, but everything else inverted. It's the same kind of visual parallel that Oda draws with other narrative opposites in the series, but taken to the absolute maximum level. These two characters are designed to look like each other in certain ways specifically, so that you can see exactly where they diverge. Luffy is Joy Boy's will expressed forward. The heir to that promise, the one who arrives at the appointed time. And Emu is Joy Boy's opposite, the one who defeated Joy Boy 800 years ago, who has spent 8 centuries making sure Joy Boy's world never comes to be, who has been watching the world for the return of that Haki signature, waiting for it to appear, knowing that when it does, the unfinished battle will resume. Because that's what the giant straw hat is really saying. It's not a trophy, it's a warning system, it's a reminder. Imu preserved the connection to Joy Boy because Imu knows the story isn't finished. Imu knows that Joy Boy said he'd return, that the One Piece prophesies it, that the drums of liberation will sound again one day, and Imu has been ready for that day for 800 years. And Luffy just activated them. At Egghead, in full view of the world, now everything we've been building to is accelerating. And this is where I want to look at the complete picture of Imu's design and what it tells us about how this story ends. Because I think if you take all of the foreshadowing we've covered today and lay it out as a unified whole, it creates a surprisingly complete picture of who Imu is, what Imu's weaknesses are, and what the final confrontation is probably going to look like. Let me do the complete design breakdown first, right? Let me just go through every major element of Imu's chapter 1179 reveal and show you the chapter where Oda planted it. The ringed eyes. We talked about this. Chapter 50, Mihawk. Nearly 19 years before the reveal. The exact same specific eye design used on the world's greatest swordsman and then on the king of the world, the white hair. Chapter 1035, King's face reveal. The Lunarian racial trait that Oda established through King 3 years before Imu's full reveal, the dark skin. Also, Chapter 1035. Also King, also part of the Lunarian visual template, the wings. Chapter 920, King's first appearance. The Lunarian black wing design, later confirmed as part of Imu's awakened form in Chapter 1179. The curved horns, Chapter 795. Kaido, the ancient giant and Oni horn design, with Imu's version being more elaborate, suggesting a deeper, more original connection to that bloodline. The Hagoromo awakened clouds. Chapter 1, 1044, Luffy's Gear 5. That's actually where the Hagoromo clouds as a visual element for awakened power was most prominently established in the reader's mind, even though other awakened users had them before. And then, Chapter 1, 1110 gave us the Five Elders version, cementing it as the visual language for awakened Zoan power. The eye-covered clouds. This one is the exception. This is the detail in Chapter 1179 that has no clear precedent. This is the one truly new element. And I think that's intentional. I think Oda gave us everything else through foreshadowing and then reserved this one element as the genuine surprise. The marker of the original versus the copies. The thing that distinguishes Imu from the Five Elders in a visually unmistakable way. It's Oda saying 90% of this design you could have figured out from what I already showed you. But this 10%? This is new. This is the thing about Imu that even the foreshadowing couldn't fully prepare you for. The tail. Chapter 1, 1085. Visible in the monster silhouette when Imu kills Cobra. The connection to the Void Century. Chapter 906. The giant straw hat implied it from day one. The Joy Boy opposition. Chapter 6, 128. The first poneglyph discussion and everything since. The entire Joy Boy mystery was being set up in parallel with Imu's mystery. When you lay it out like that, right? When you just see the list of evidence in front of you, it's staggering. The only genuinely new piece of visual information in Chapter 1179's full reveal is the eye-covered clouds. Everything else was already in the series, waiting to be understood in context. Oda scattered the puzzle pieces across hundreds of chapters and then assembled them in Chapter 1179. And now that it's assembled, you can trace every piece back to where it came from. Now, let me talk about the bloodlines. Because I think one of the most underappreciated aspects of Imu's design is that he's pulling from at least 3 different ancient racial lineages simultaneously. The Lunarian blood is the most obvious. White hair, dark skin, wings, connection to the race that lived on the Red Line and were called gods. We've covered this extensively. And the implication is that Imu is either a Lunarian by birth or has somehow incorporated Lunarian traits into his physical existence over 800 years. The ancient giant, or Oni blood, is the second. The horns, the demonic scale, the connection to the ancient beings that predate the current giants, the double-curved S-horns that are more elaborate than Kaido's, suggesting a deeper or more original connection to that lineage. And then there's a third element, the unknown element, the tattoos that don't match any established racial design we've seen. The circuit-like markings covering the body that feel technological or ritualistic in a way that goes beyond standard one-piece aesthetic. The eye embedded in the hand. The symbols that look different from Lunarian design and different from ancient giant design. And I think that third element might be pointing toward whatever comes before the known races in One Piece's timeline. The truly ancient origin. The first race, maybe. Whatever came before the Lunarians and the ancient giants. Whatever existed in the world before the Void Centuries 800 years ago. Back to some even deeper prehistory that One Piece hasn't fully excavated yet. And I think that's the element of Imu's design that's going to matter most in the final stretch of the story, because the Lunarian connection explains the physical form, the ancient giant connection explains the power scale, but whatever that third element is, that's the one that explains the immortality. That's the one that explains how Imu has been alive for 800 plus years. That's the one that connects to the national treasure, and the ancient weapons, and the deepest secret of Mary Geoise. And here's the thing that makes me really excited about this analysis, right? Here's the thing that has me genuinely looking forward to the next phase of the Elbaf arc. Everything we've discussed today, every piece of foreshadowing, every design connection, every narrative parallel, all of it is pointing at a specific structure for how this story resolves. Joy Boy lost 800 years ago. He was too early. The prophecy says as much. Joy Boy couldn't fulfill his promises, not because his mission was wrong, but because the timing wasn't right. The alliance wasn't strong enough. The world wasn't ready, and Imu won that battle. Imu took the throne. Imu built the world government on the ruins of the ancient kingdom, and Imu has been maintaining that victory for 8 centuries, pruning any threat before it can grow strong enough to challenge him. But here's what's different about now. Luffy doesn't just have Joy Boy's will. He has Joy Boy's will plus the experience of the entire journey, plus the Grand Fleet, plus the giants of Elbaf, plus every ally gathered from Alabasta to Wano to Egghead. Joy Boy was alone, or his alliance wasn't enough. Luffy is the result of 800 years of Oda building the human connections that Joy Boy didn't have, and the foreshadowing of Imu's weaknesses is already embedded in the design. Chapter 1. 1179 showed us Imu coughing up what appears to be black blood or a dark substance before transforming, before even engaging anyone in combat, before taking any damage, just arriving at Elbaf and already showing physical strain, and the 5 elders were clearly terrified about Imu leaving Mary Geoise. That fear is specific. It's not general concern for their leader's well-being. It's the fear of people who know that their master has a specific vulnerability to being outside the Holy Land. The most compelling explanation is that Imu's power is tied to Mary Geoise in some fundamental way. Maybe to the empty throne itself, maybe to whatever the national treasure is, maybe to the mother flame that York was working on in this very chapter, maybe to the red line, to the physical location where the Lunarian's kingdom of the gods once stood. Whatever it is, Imu is weaker in Elbaf than in Mary Geoise, and the physical evidence of that weakness appeared before the fight even started. And then there's the Joy Boy Haki connection. Chapter 1119 showed us that Imu's reaction to Joy Boy's Haki is not neutral, it's not indifferent, it's the opposite of that. It's visceral and painful and personal, which means, in a combat context, Luffy's attacks in Gear 5 should be specifically exceptionally effective against Imu. Not just because Luffy is strong in Gear 5, which he obviously is, but because the Haki he's expressing in that form is specifically the one that Imu has a deep 800-year-old vulnerability to. Luffy isn't just going to fight Imu. Luffy is going to fight Imu with the exact weapon that Joy Boy used against Imu in the Void Century. And this time, the one wielding it is going to be standing in Elbaf surrounded by every ally that the entire journey of One Piece has been building toward. Joy Boy lost because he was too early. Luffy arrives at the appointed time. And everything that made Joy Boy insufficient 800 years ago has been addressed in the 100+ arcs of this series. But here's what I'm most excited about. And this is kind of the final piece of the analysis for today. The piece that I think brings everything full circle in the most satisfying way. Think about the structure of what Oda has done with Imu's reveal. Think about it from a pure craft perspective. Chapter 906 drops in 2018 and gives us a shadow, 2 ringed eyes, and a giant straw hat. That's all. But the ringed eyes, those were already in the manga from 1999, from Chapter 50, from Mihawk's introduction. The moment Oda drew those eyes in 2018, everyone who had been reading since 1999 had already seen them. On a different face, in a different context. But the pattern was already there in their memory. And then Chapter 1035 in 2021 shows us King's Lunarian face. White hair, dark skin, tattoo placement, and the readers see it and process it as King's design. But Oda already knows he's planting the second major component of Imu's reveal. And Chapter 1110 in 2024 gives us the 5 Elders' awakened forms. The Hagoromo clouds, the demon folklore, the power structure, and readers process it as the 5 Elders' arc. But Oda is building the visual grammar for Imu's awakened form. And then Chapter 1179, April 2026, and every single visual element in the reveal is something the reader has already seen. In a different context, as a different character, but already in their memory. Oda didn't just design a villain and reveal him. He taught the reader to see the villain through every other character first, so that when the reveal came, the reaction wasn't just, "Oh wow, he looks cool." The reaction was, oh, I've seen this. I've been seeing this for years. I just didn't know I was seeing it. That's not just good planning. That's a completely different level of storytelling craft. That's Oda using the entire 27-year history of the series as a delivery mechanism for a single character reveal. Every chapter that introduced King, or showed Mihawk's eyes, or revealed Zunesha, or showed Kaido's horns was simultaneously a chapter in Imu's story. We just didn't know it. And now we do. I found, going through this research, 47 specific visual and textual elements across the series that connect to Imu's Chapter 1179 reveal. 47. And I probably missed a dozen more because that's how Oda works. He buries things so deeply and so specifically that you can do this kind of analysis for years and keep finding new threads, keep finding new connections, keep opening up new panels and going, wait, that was there the whole time. Let me close with the thing that I find most remarkable about this whole story. 800 years. Imu has been sitting on that throne for 800 years, watching every king rise and fall, watching Roger find the One Piece, watching Whitebeard shake the world, watching the Revolutionary Army build, watching Luffy come up from East Blue, watching everything unfold, and keeping that straw hat in a frozen vault the whole time, waiting. Because here's the thing about Imu's perspective, right? From Imu's perspective, Joy Boy was the greatest threat he ever faced. The one time he was genuinely challenged. The one fight that almost went the other way. And he won. He's been winning ever since. 800 years of winning. And the question that must have haunted him for 800 years, if Imu is the kind of being who can be haunted by things, is whether the prophecy is real. Whether Joy Boy is actually coming back. Whether the drums will sound again. And in chapter 1119, they did. And in chapter 1179, Imu responded by going to Elbaf himself, abandoning the safety of Mary Geoise, despite the clear risk that going to Elbaf poses to his physical state, despite everything the five elders were afraid of, despite the blood he was already coughing up on arrival. Imu decided that this time he wasn't going to delegate. He wasn't going to send Saturn or the Marines or the Seraphim. He was going to deal with Joy Boy's heir personally. Because Imu knows. After 800 years, he knows that this is the one. The appointed time. The person the prophecy was always pointing toward. And after 8 centuries of waiting, after maintaining control through 1,000 proxies and agents and subordinates, after keeping the world in exactly the state he wanted it for 800 years, Imu is finally taking the field himself. And Luffy is at Elbaf. And every giant on the island, and every ally Luffy has gathered across the entire journey. And the drums of liberation that Imu has been dreading since 800 years ago. They're all in the same place. Oda has been building to this for 27 years. He scattered the pieces of Imu across the entire series. He hid them in King and Mihawk and Kaido and Zunesha and the 5 elders and a silhouetted monster and a frozen hat. He planted the clues in 1999 and 2015 and 2018 and 2021 and 2023 and 2024. And Chapter 1179 showed us the assembled picture. We had all the pieces. We just didn't know we were looking at a puzzle. And now the puzzle is complete, and the final battle can begin. This has been Anime Autopsy. I found every piece of foreshadowing of Imu's true form. Oda drew it years ago, and now we all see it. If you made it this far, thank you genuinely for watching. Drop in the comments which piece of foreshadowing hit you hardest, because I want to know if the Mihawk connection broke anyone else's brain the way it broke mine when I first mapped it out. And if you want to see the companion video where we go deep on Imu's devil fruit and the theory that Imu might be the progenitor of all devil fruits, that one is coming very, very soon. I'll see you there. Part 2. Alright, I want to go back and fill in something I glossed over earlier that I think actually deserves its own deep dive. And that's the specific chapter-by-chapter timeline of how Oda constructed Imu's silhouette appearances. Because when you map them out in sequence, what you realize is that each appearance was strategically withholding different information in a way that was building toward the chapter 1179 reveal in very deliberate increments. Chapter 906 is the introduction. Imu is humanoid. Relatively human-sized compared to the giant straw hat. The crown and the ringed eyes are the identifying details. The overall impression is of a mysterious human ruler. At this point, the average reader is thinking this is some ancient immortal human. Some first-generation world noble who never died. The monster aspect is completely hidden. Chapter 9:108 adds the throne context. We see Imu sitting on the empty throne, which in itself is an enormously symbolic detail. Because the whole mythology of the world government is that no single person rules. That the throne is empty as a symbol of collective authority. That power is distributed across the Gorosei and the world nobles. rather than concentrated in a single monarch. That's the official story. That's the founding myth. And chapter 908 shows us that it's a lie. The throne is not empty. It has never been empty. There has always been a king. And here's what that one detail does narratively. It doesn't just reveal that Imu exists, it reveals that the entire foundational ideology of the world government is a fiction. Everything the celestial dragons believe about the distribution of divine authority, everything the five elders act as if they're the top of the hierarchy for, is a performance. A theatre of governance designed to hide the fact that there is, and always has been, a single absolute ruler. Chapter 908 was revealing the mechanism of the deception, not just the existence of the deceiver. That's how much information Oda was packing into a silhouette chapter. Chapter 1060 is the power demonstration. Lulusia Kingdom disappears. And the framing connects it to Imu in a way that is unmistakable, even without direct confirmation. Because right before Lulusia disappears, we see Imu with those pictures, with those images of people. And then an island is erased. Imu pointed at something, and it ceased to exist. And the scale of it, an entire island, is meant to establish immediately that whatever Imu is, the power level is off the charts. We're not talking about a normal human. We're not talking even about a normal devil fruit user. We're talking about someone who can casually delete geography from existence. And here's something really interesting about chapter 1060 that I think deserves more attention. The framing of that chapter positioned Lulusia's destruction as something done from above. Something falling from the sky or something projected from high altitude. And at the time, everyone assumed Uranus. Ancient weapon. Big sky-based weapon. That makes sense. But now, with chapter 1179, with what we know about Imu's awakened form and the clouds with eyes that surround him, I wonder if the destruction of Lulusia was more personal than we thought. If Imu's awakened power itself can project something of that scale. The clouds aren't just aesthetic. The eyes in those clouds aren't just symbolic. If those eyes are functional, if they're connected to some kind of output, the implications are genuinely horrifying. Chapter 1085 we've covered. The monster silhouette. But I want to add something about the context of that chapter that makes it even more important. Because chapter 1085 isn't just the chapter where Imu kills Cobra. It's the chapter where Sabo witnesses it and escapes to report it to the Revolutionary Army. And Oda framing this specific revelation as the thing that Sabo sees and escapes with is very deliberate, because it means the Revolutionary Army now knows. Dragon now knows. And Dragon's response to knowing, whatever it ends up being, is going to be a crucial thread in the endgame. The monster form reveal in chapter 1085 wasn't just about showing readers that Imu is monstrous. It was about setting up the chain of knowledge that's going to matter in the final arc. And then chapter 1110 and the five elders forms, which we've covered. But I want to point out one more thing about that chapter that I think is specifically relevant to today's analysis. Chapter 1110 was also the chapter where we started to understand the logistics of how the five elders function. The magic circles, the summoning, the fact that they can be called through some kind of ritualistic mechanism rather than just physically traveling to a location. That mechanic is important because it's showing us that the five elders are, in some sense, tethered. They're connected to something. Their ability to appear across the world isn't just a power they have independently. It's a power that comes from a system, from a structure, from the same source that gives them their awakened forms, and that source is Imu. Chapter 1. 1179 confirmed it with Saturn's death. Imu is the anchor point. The system runs through Imu, and understanding that the five elders are tethered to Imu, that their power is Imu's power delegated rather than independently owned, changes how you read chapter 1110 completely. Every time a Five Elder appeared and seemed invincible, that invincibility was borrowed. Every time they regenerated, that regeneration was on loan. Everything we were scared of with the Five Elders was actually Imu, being powerful at a distance. Okay, I want to get into something that I've been building toward, and I think is going to be one of the most interesting sections of this video, and that's the question of what Imu actually is. Not who, but what. Because chapter 1179 confirmed a lot of things about Imu's design and appearance. But the nature of what Imu is, the fundamental category of being, is still genuinely mysterious. And I think the foreshadowing we've been analyzing today actually gives us more to work with on that question than most people realize. Let me lay out the options as I see them. Option 1. Imu is a hybrid being with multiple ancient racial bloodlines. A Lunarian ancient giant crossbreed or something even more complex. Someone who carries the genetics of multiple ancient races and whose 800-year lifespan is an extension of natural Lunarian longevity, combined with whatever powers the other bloodlines confer. In this version, Imu is exceptional but comprehensible within the existing racial taxonomy of One Piece. He's what happens when you have the most ancient and powerful bloodlines all in one being. Option 2. Imu ate a specific devil fruit that grants immortality and is the source of the awakened powers he distributes to the Five Elders. In this version, Imu is the ultimate devil fruit user, the one who not only awakened his own fruit, but figured out how to extend that awakening outward to others. The blood coughing would be the cost of using this fruit outside its optimal conditions, and the eye-covered clouds would be the unique manifestation of this specific fruit, something no other devil fruit can replicate because Imu's fruit is singular. Option 3, and this is the one I find most intellectually interesting. Imu is not using a devil fruit in the conventional sense. Imu is something older than devil fruits. Maybe Imu is the reason devil fruits exist. The progenitor, the source, the entity whose fundamental nature, whose existence in the world, created the conditions from which devil fruits emerged. In this version, the Void Century wasn't just a war between the Ancient Kingdom and the 20 Kingdoms. It was a war between Joy Boy, representing a natural world in harmony with the sea, and Imu, representing a corrupting force that disrupted that natural order. And the disruption that Imu represents is the thing that created the devil in devil fruits. The reason the sea hates devil fruit users is the same reason the sea would hate Imu if it could express that hatred directly. That third option maps onto a lot of things in the lore that have never been fully explained. Why does eating a devil fruit make you unable to swim? Why does the sea specifically drain devil fruit powers? The standard answer is that there's a devil in the fruit and the sea is antagonistic to that devil. But what if that's actually literally true? What if there is a specific entity that the sea's animosity is pointed at, and devil fruit users just happen to carry a piece of that entity's essence? What if every devil fruit user is carrying a fragment of Imu's power without knowing it? I don't know if Oda is going that direction. I want to be honest about that. That's deep theory territory. But the way chapter 1179 positioned Imu, the way the introduction boxes described his power not as a single devil fruit, but in a way that suggested something more inclusive, something that might mean devil fruits as a category rather than a specific individual fruit. That's the thing that has me thinking along these lines, and I'll be diving into that specifically in the next video. But for today, what I want to establish is this. Whatever Imu fundamentally is, the foreshadowing has been telling us certain things about his nature for years. The ringed eye connection to ancient beings. The racial markers of the most powerful ancient bloodlines. The connection to the Void Century survivor who has been maintaining a specific historical fiction for 8 centuries. The reaction to Joy Boy's Haki that suggests direct personal history. And the physical vulnerability that appears when Imu operates outside of Mary Geoise. All of these foreshadowing elements, taken together, paint a portrait of something very specific. Imu is powerful because he's old. Not just old in the sense of being long-lived, old in the sense of being connected to whatever the world was before it became what it is now. Before the Void Century, before the world government, before the current ocean. Imu is the last remnant of a previous world order, a previous state of reality. And his power isn't just personal strength, it's the inertia of 800 years of that world order persisting. Imu is the world government the same way that a king and their kingdom are inseparable. You can't defeat Imu by just beating Imu in a fight, any more than you can defeat a kingdom by fighting the king in a duel. You have to dismantle the entire architecture. You have to unwrite the history that Imu has been writing for 8 centuries. You have to make the Void Century known, and that's what the Straw Hats have been building toward the entire time, without always knowing it. The poneglyphs, the true history, the will of the D-Joy Boy's promise. All of it is the mechanism for dismantling the lie that Imu built 800 years ago, and Luffy is at Elbaf, and the giants are there, and the drums of liberation are sounding. Let me now go back to something I mentioned earlier and expand on it considerably, because I think it's one of the most underrated pieces of evidence in this entire analysis. The Lunarian Law from chapter 1022, the Marco dialogue about the race that lived on the Red Line and was called gods. Because there's a specific aspect of that law that I don't think has been fully processed in the context of what chapter 1179 revealed. The Lunarians were called the Kingdom of the Gods. They lived on the Red Line, specifically on top of it, where Mary Geoise now stands. And they were nearly exterminated by the world government. Now, chapter 1022 had Marco framing this as a historical curiosity, as background lore about King's people. But here's the thing. The world government is active right now in hunting Lunarians 100 million berries for information. That's not a historical reward for a historical enemy. That's an active, ongoing campaign. The world government is still trying to eliminate Lunarians in the present day of the story. So Imu, the founder and supreme ruler of the world government, has been running an 800-year campaign to exterminate his own race. Whatever Lunarians are to Imu, they're not just an enemy. They're not just a conquered people. They're a specific ongoing threat that requires active elimination for 8 centuries. Why? What is it about a surviving Lunarian that is so dangerous to Imu specifically? Because the general population of the world doesn't know what a Lunarian is. Most people in One Piece have never heard of the Lunarian race. The world government erased that history the same way they erased everything else from the Void Century. The average person doesn't know the Kingdom of the Gods existed, doesn't know who used to live on the Red Line before Mary Geoise was built. So the fear of Lunarian survivors isn't about public knowledge, it's about something else. My best theory is that Lunarians, by virtue of their racial biology, represent proof, physical, embodied, walking proof of what existed on the Red Line before Imu took it. Every living Lunarian is a witness, a piece of evidence. And Imu's entire system of power rests on the fiction that the world government's authority is legitimate and ancient and divinely ordained. If Lunarians exist, and if someone finds out what Lunarians are, the questions that follow are dangerous. Who were the people who lived on the Red Line before the world government? What happened to them? Why does the world government have a reward for turning them in? The questions lead to the answers. The answers lead to the Void Century. And the Void Century is the one thing Imu cannot allow to become common knowledge. Which is why King's survival is so specifically threatening. It's not that King is physically powerful, though he obviously is. It's that King is a Lunarian who exists, who breathes, who people can see, who is walking around and identifying himself as a Lunarian to anyone who looks at him or fights him. And as long as King is alive, the questions are possible. The thread can be pulled. And now here's the thing that makes all of this foreshadowing even more resonant. Because King's survival as the last Lunarian wasn't an accident of war. It was specific. It was personal. Imu's campaign to eliminate Lunarians somehow failed to get King. And King ended up under Kaido's protection. Under Kaido, who was also an unusually powerful being with ancient giant traits. Under Kaido, whose own nature as a physical specimen beyond anything the world had seen, was connected to the same ancient bloodlines that Imu represents. Was Kaido's protection of King deliberate? Did Kaido know what King was and why the world government wanted him? Kaido certainly wasn't afraid of the world government in any practical sense. He survived everything they threw at him for decades. But I wonder if part of Kaido's relationship with King was specifically about protecting the thing the world government most wanted to erase. Kaido, who wanted to die in a worthy fight, who seemed to find the current world unsatisfying, shallow, not worthy. Maybe Kaido, like King, understood something about what the world was before the world government built its fiction. Maybe that's the deeper bond between them. I'm speculating here. I want to be honest about that. But the foreshadowing of King's design pointing toward Imu's design, combined with Kaido's ancient giant traits pointing toward Imu's traits, combined with the world government's specific hatred of Lunarians, creates a web of connections that I think is going to matter in ways we don't fully understand yet. Okay, let's do something a little different for this next section, because I've been spending a lot of time on the design foreshadowing, which is the most concrete evidence. But there's another category of foreshadowing that I think deserves attention: behavioral foreshadowing. The way Imu has acted in the chapters where we've seen him, and how those actions in retrospect reveal things about what he is and what he's afraid of. Think about Chapter 1, 1085 again. When Imu kills Cobra. This is the closest thing to an Imu action scene we had before Chapter 1179. And the choice of target is interesting. Cobra is coming to the Five Elders with a question. He wants to know who Nefertari D. Lily was, and why the D appears in her name when Ds are supposed to be the enemies of the celestial dragons. He wants to know about Lily's choice not to become one of the 20 kings 800 years ago. He wants to understand the history that was deliberately obscured. And Imu kills him personally. Not the Five Elders, not the CP agents. Imu. Personally, in monster form, with the tail. And this is notable because in every other instance we've seen Imu operates through intermediaries, through the Five Elders, through the Seraphim, through the various mechanisms of the world government. Imu does not typically take direct action. That's the model. Absolute ruler acts through proxies. But Cobra asked the right questions. Cobra was getting too close to the specific historical truth that Imu has spent 800 years burying. And for that, Imu appeared personally. Monster form, no intermediaries, because certain truths are too dangerous to let anyone handle but Imu himself. And what's the specific truth that Cobra was reaching for? The connection between the Nefertari family and the Void Century. The question of why Nefertari D. Lily didn't join the 20 kings, whether she had a different plan, whether she stayed behind because she was working against the world government from within Alabasta, whether the Nefertari family's exceptional status among the kingdoms, the fact that they're beloved by their people in a way that celestial dragon-connected kingdoms usually aren't, is connected to an 800-year-old choice that Lily made. Cobra asking those questions while standing in front of the empty throne was an existential threat, not because Cobra himself could do anything with the answers, but because the answers, if spoken aloud, might lead to other questions, might create a chain of inquiry. And Imu has been maintaining the silence of the Void Century for 800 years specifically by preventing those chains of inquiry from starting. The behavioral foreshadowing here is that Imu is most dangerous when the specific truth of the Void Century is at risk. That's the trigger. Not military threats, not individual powerful fighters. The historical truth, which tells us something important about how this story will ultimately resolve. You can't defeat Imu by beating him in a fight alone. You have to expose the truth, the poneglyphs, the true history. The story of the Void Century that the world government erased. That's the weapon. And every moment that Imu has personally intervened in the series so far has been in response to that specific threat. Now let me talk about Zunesha in more depth, because I mentioned the ringed eyes, but I didn't spend as much time as I should have on why Zunesha specifically having those eyes matters for this analysis. Zunesha has been walking the seas for over 1,000 years. That's immediately noteworthy because Imu has been alive for 800 years. Zunesha predates Imu's creation of the world government. Zunesha was already ancient when the Void Century happened, and Zunesha was punished, sentenced to walk the seas forever, never stopping, never resting, never dying, by someone from the Void Century for a crime that Zunesha committed, now. Who had the authority to sentence an ancient being to 1,000 years of punishment? In the context of what we now know about the Void Century, there are only a few options. Either it was Joy Boy's side, or it was Imu's side. And here's the thing. The punishment that Zunesha carries, the obligation to walk forever and never stop, is a punishment in the spirit of control. It's a punishment that removes autonomy, that replaces free will with compulsion, that takes a being capable of independent existence and forces it into a pattern it cannot deviate from. That's Imu's style, not Joy Boy's. Joy Boy represents liberation. Joy Boy's entire legacy is about promising freedom, about unfulfilling promises because the world isn't ready for them yet, about the eventual day when all the cages open. Joy Boy doesn't sentence ancient beings to eternal forced movement. Imu sentences ancient beings to eternal forced movement. But wait, then why does Zunesha have the ringed eyes? If the ringed eyes are a marker connecting to the same power or lineage or Void Century connection as Imu, why does an ancient elephant who was presumably on the opposing side of the Void Century conflict carry that marker? And this is where it gets really interesting, because I think the ringed eye marker is older than Imu. I think it predates the conflict. I think it's a marker of something both Imu and certain other ancient beings share because they're all drawing from the same deep source. Not because they're on the same side, but because they're all products of a specific era or a specific power that existed before the Void Century made sides. Maybe the ringed eyes are the marker of a being who was alive before the Void Century in its entirety. Zunesha was. Imu claims to be among the original 20, but his actual age might be deeper than 800 years. Mihawk, with his demonic clan name and mysterious history, might have a connection to that era that's hidden in his family's past. The ringed eyes as the mark of pre-Void Century origin, of beings who were there before the war, or who are connected by blood or power to what existed before. That framework, right? That framework would explain a lot of things that currently seem like disconnected mysteries. It would explain why Zunesha has the eyes despite being neither a villain nor a world government tool. It would explain why Mihawk has the eyes despite being a character with no apparent connection to the world government or the ancient bloodlines we've been discussing. It would place them all in the same category, not as allies or enemies, but as ancient things. Remnants of a world that existed before the current world was built. And if that's true, then the ringed eyes aren't pointing us toward an alliance. They're pointing us toward an age, an era, a time in the One Piece world's history that we haven't yet accessed through the poneglyphs or the Void Century flashbacks. Something even older. Something that the story might be building toward revealing in the final act of the Elbaf arc or beyond. I want to spend some time now on something that I think is one of the most emotionally resonant pieces of Imu foreshadowing in the series. And that's the Joy Boy Haki recognition scene in Chapter 1, 1119 in more depth than I covered it earlier, because I think that scene deserves a lot more attention than it typically gets. When Luffy activates Gear 5 at Egghead and releases that Haki burst, the effect radiates outward, and we see various characters around the world reacting to it. Their hearts lifting, their spirits responding to something they can't explain. This is Joy Boy's Haki, the Haki of the sun god Nika, the Haki of liberation and freedom, washing over the world and touching something deep in every living being that feels it. Because Joy Boy's mission, what Joy Boy stood for, resonates with something fundamental in the people of this world who have ever wanted to be free. And then we cut to Imu. And the reaction is different. It's not resonance. It's not inspiration. It's not the heart lifting. It's a scream. It's physical pain or something that looks like physical pain. It's recognition in the way that a scar aches when the weather changes. the body remembering damage that the conscious mind might prefer to forget. 800 years later, and the specific frequency of that Haki signature still does something to Imu that nothing else we've seen in the series does. Think about what that means for the stakes of everything we've been discussing. Imu has been operating for 8 centuries from a position of absolute security. The architecture of control is in place. The history is suppressed. The world believes the world government's authority is legitimate. The 5 elders manage any immediate threats. The warlords, the marines, the CP units, all of it is running smoothly, and nothing has touched Imu personally. Nothing has reached through all of those layers and actually affected Imu in any visceral, physical way. Until chapter 1119. Until Joy Boy's Haki. That's what the Void Century conflict means in emotional terms. That's why Joy Boy's legacy matters to Imu in a way that no other threat in 800 years has. Because Joy Boy is the one who actually hurt Imu, the one who got close, the one who made Imu feel something other than security and control. And that specific Haki is the sensory record of that experience. The body's memory of the one battle where the outcome wasn't certain. And when you put that together with what we see in chapter 1179, with Imu bleeding before he's done anything, with Imu clearly showing strain just from being an Elbaf, it creates this portrait of an 800-year-old being who is about to be tested in a way he hasn't been tested since the Void Century, who has maintained perfect control for 8 centuries and is now facing the one thing that has ever genuinely threatened that control. The foreshadowing of that moment was in chapter 1119. But the seeds of it were planted even earlier. In chapter 906, with the giant straw hat being preserved rather than displayed. In Imu's choice to keep that specific object rather than destroy it. That tells you something about Imu's psychology. That tells you that Imu has been living with the knowledge that the cycle might restart, that Joy Boy said he'd return, and that the straw hat is the artifact of that possibility. The physical object that links the 800-year-old victory to the potential future defeat. Imu doesn't destroy the straw hat because he needs it, not as a trophy, as a reminder, as a kept close version of the specific thing he's afraid of. And now the person who inherited that hat is at Elbaf. Let me bring something in now that I think adds another dimension to the foreshadowing analysis, and that's the structural foreshadowing. Not visual design, not specific dialogue, but the narrative patterns themselves. The way Oda constructed the story so that certain structures are put in place that only pay off in retrospect. The most important structural foreshadowing for Imu, in my view, is the Yonko system itself. Because think about the history of the sea as we understand it in One Piece. For decades before the series began, the major maritime powers were the 4 Yonko ruling the New World and the Marines enforcing world government law. And the Yonko are described as a kind of balance. Their power is so immense that no single force, not even the Marines, not even multiple Yonko working together, can eliminate any one of them without catastrophic cost. It's a stalemate, a balance of terror, and Oda has been systematically dismantling that balance throughout the series. Whitebeard died at Marineford, Kaido and Big Mom went down at Wano, Shanks is at Elbaf, Blackbeard is somewhere building toward his own endgame. The Yonko system that held the New World in check for decades is collapsing in real time. The balance of power that prevented the world government from exercising complete control over the seas is being removed. Why? Why structure the story so that all the major external checks on world government power are eliminated or weakened during the run-up to the final arc? Because the final enemy isn't a Yonko. The final enemy is the world government itself, and more specifically, the person at the top of it. And Oda has been clearing the field. Every Yonko arc wasn't just a story about that particular Yonko. It was also a structural piece of the setup for the final confrontation. Every time a major power that wasn't under world government control was removed or destabilized, the story moved another step closer to the moment when all of that power, all of that narrative energy, concentrates on Imu. The structural foreshadowing was in the very architecture of the story. The Yonko system as a delaying mechanism. The series of arcs that systematically addressed each Yonko as the story moved toward Imu as the true final boss. This is the kind of foreshadowing that you can only see in retrospect, looking back at 27 years of story. But it's absolutely deliberate. Oda knew where the story was going. Oda designed the macro structure of One Piece so that every major arc was simultaneously a complete story in itself and a step in the long march toward Imu. Let me also talk about something that I think is genuinely fascinating, and that connects the visual design foreshadowing to something more thematic. And that's the specific way that Oda has been using the concept of the sun throughout the series, the sun god. Nika, Joy Boy, and the will he carries. The liberation that Luffy's Gear 5 represents, the drums of liberation, the white clouds and the bright visual palette. Luffy in Gear 5 looks like a sun. He looks like warmth and light and freedom embodied. And the world responds to his power the way a cold room responds to being filled with sunlight. Things come alive, but with joy, with freedom. The darkness recedes. And then there's what happens when Imu arrives. The black clouds, the evil laughing faces on the buildings, the darkness spreading, the transformation of the environment into something oppressive and threatening. And the light that Imu manifests isn't sunlight. It's not even the dark fire of the Lunarians, which still has that element of flame's inherent energy and light. It's something colder, something abyssal. The flames around Imu's weapons look evil in a way that suggests the absence of warmth rather than its presence. The sun versus the abyss. That's the underlying visual metaphor that Oda has been building. And the sun-abyss opposition doesn't just apply to Luffy and Imu directly. It runs through the entire series as a thread. Think about the Sky Islands and the Sky Pyre arc. The sun up there, literally closer to the sun. Enel claiming to be a god because he rules the sky, the domain associated with sun and lightning. And Luffy, operating from below, from the sea level, from the human world, arriving and challenging that claimed divinity. It's a micro version of the macro story. The pretend sun god versus the genuine will of liberation. Think about Fishman Island and the darkness of the deep sea. The Straw Hats going down rather than up. Into the darkness rather than toward the light. And down there, the themes of oppression and liberation playing out in the history of how fishermen were treated. And Joy Boy's promise to Poseidon specifically. Joy Boy made a promise to someone who lived in the deepest part of the sea. The sun god made a promise that reached all the way to the abyss. And now we have Imu, visually associated with darkness, with black clouds and oppressive fires and the building faces that look like they're screaming in mad worship rather than rejoicing in freedom. And the contrast to Luffy's sun imagery, to Joy Boy's sun god heritage, is explicit and intentional, and has been being built across the entire series. The visual foreshadowing of Imu wasn't just in specific characters and design elements, it was in the thematic visual language of the series itself, in the choice to associate certain aesthetics with liberation and others with oppression. In the careful construction of an opposition that would eventually resolve in the final conflict between the sun god's heir and the whatever Imu is. Okay, I want to do something a little self-referential here because I've been building this analysis for a while now and I want to step back and address a question that I think is going to come up in the comments. And that question is, does all of this foreshadowing mean that the story is predictable? Does knowing that Oda planned this far ahead mean that we can now predict exactly how the rest of One Piece is going to go? And the answer is genuinely no. And here's why. The foreshadowing we've been analysing today tells us the what of Imu's design. It tells us the what of the narrative oppositions. Lunarian versus corrupted Lunarian. Joy Boy versus anti-Joy Boy. Sun versus Abyss. Drums of liberation versus drums of oppression. These are the structural bones, these are the things Oda planned. But Oda's genius isn't just in planning the structure, it's in filling that structure with specifics that nobody could have predicted. the eye-covered clouds in Imu's awakened form. Nobody was predicting that specifically. The coughing of blood on arrival at Elbaf. The fact that Oda chose to show us Imu's weakness in the same chapter as his full reveal. The specific design of the weapons and the mythology they're drawing from. The texture and detail of the reveal. The foreshadowing tells us where we're going. But Oda is going to make the journey there surprising in ways we can't predict, because the specific, moment-to-moment storytelling decisions, the precise character beats, the exact imagery Oda chooses for each scene, those aren't forecastable from the foreshadowing. The foreshadowing tells you the destination. Oda decides how you get there, and that's where the surprises live. Which is why I'm incredibly excited for what comes next. Because we know broadly that this is building toward Luffy confronting Imu. We know it's going to involve Joy Boy's legacy and the true history of the Void Century and the giants of Elbaf and everything that's been building since Chapter 1. But we don't know what specific chapter Oda is going to use to make us cry. We don't know what moment is going to feel like Marineford times 10 in terms of emotional impact. We don't know which character is going to have their long-built payoff at exactly the right moment. And frankly, the fact that Oda has been this precise about the foreshadowing makes the unpredictable moments land harder. Because when everything around a specific choice is clearly planned and structured, the specific choice itself feels even more intentional. Every single thing in Chapter 1179 hit harder because of 27 years of construction behind it. Let me also quickly address the Seraphim, because I think they're an underappreciated piece of the Imu foreshadowing puzzle. The Seraphim, right? Artificial beings created using King's Lunarian DNA. With Lunarian physical features, white hair, dark skin, wings. Created by Vegapunk under world government direction, and their name, Seraphim, the angels closest to God. In the Bible, the Seraphim are the beings who attend directly to the divine presence. They're the highest order of angels. And Imu ordered their creation. Why? Why would Imu specifically want artificial beings with Lunarian physical traits serving as the world government's ultimate weapons? If Imu has been trying to exterminate Lunarians for 800 years, why create things that look like Lunarians? Here's my theory. The Seraphim are replacements. Imu has been eliminating the natural Lunarians for 8 centuries because natural Lunarians are uncontrollable. They have their own will, their own power, their own history. They're living proof of what existed before. But artificial beings with Lunarian traits and no independent will, no history, no connection to the kingdom of the gods. Those are the perfect subordinates. All of the physical power of the race he exterminated, with none of the autonomy or the proof of concept danger. And the name Seraphim, the angels of God. Imu is positioning himself as the god whose angels attend to him. Not King's race, the original gods, but his race. His creations. His version of the Lunarian physical form, sanitized of its original content, and repurposed in service of the one who replaced the kingdom of the gods with Mary Geoise. Chapter 1. 1035's King Reveal was foreshadowing Imu's design. But the Seraphim program was the world government simultaneously trying to appropriate the Lunarian aesthetic for itself. To take the god imagery that naturally belongs to the race Imu destroyed and make it his own property. Because Imu needs to be the god. Imu needs the god imagery to belong to him. The Lunarian physical form can exist in the world as long as it's controlled by Imu, rather than representing the memory of something he destroyed. And now, King is dead, and the Seraphim program may be compromised or uncertain given everything that happened at Egghead. And Imu is at Elbaf with his full awakened form revealed. The pretense is over. The management is done. This is the end of the strategy and the beginning of the confrontation. One more thing I want to address before we get to the full conclusion, and that's the question of what the discovery of the complete foreshadowing picture means for our reading of other character mysteries in One Piece. Because if Oda did this with Imu, scattered the design elements across hundreds of chapters using existing characters as visual templates, then the methodology applies to other characters too. And the one I keep coming back to is Shanks. because Shanks is the most mysterious major character in the series in terms of what his true nature and role are. Shanks knows about the One Piece. Shanks was on Roger's ship. Shanks has been playing a very long game that nobody fully understands. Shanks asked the Gorosei for a meeting about a specific person, and they granted it. Shanks warned Whitebeard about Blackbeard in a way that suggested he knew something others didn't. Shanks intervened at Marineford in a way that ended the war, but also seemed to serve specific purposes. And Shanks is at Elbaf right now in the current arc, in the same place as Emu, in the same place as Luffy, in the place where the Void Century's deepest truths seem to be converging. I am not going to make a claim about what Shanks is or what role he's going to play. That would be its own video, and honestly, probably its own series of videos. But what I will say is this. If you apply the Imu foreshadowing methodology to Shanks, if you look at every appearance Shanks has made throughout the series, and ask yourself what specific visual and textual details Oda gave us that might be pointing at something about Shanks' nature that we haven't understood yet, you will find things. You will find details that read differently in light of everything that's been revealed. And I think the results of that analysis are going to be significant in ways that connect to the Void Century and to Emu and to everything we've been discussing today. But that's a video for another day. For now, let's bring today's analysis home. We started with chapter 906, a shadow on a throne, 2 red eyes, a giant hat in a frozen vault. And we've traced those 3 elements, those 3 initial clues, through 27 years of manga to the full reveal in chapter 1179. The shadow contained a Lunarian. The red eyes matched eyes we'd seen in 1999. The hat was the 800-year-old marker of a conflict that has defined the entire history of the world in this story. Everything in Imu's design was planted. The Lunarian features through King, the ancient giant features through Kaido, the ringed eyes through Mihawk, the awakened clouds through the 5 elders, the tail and wings through the chapter 1085 silhouette, the name through the careful kanji and wordplay that Oda built into the character's identity from the beginning. 47 confirmed connections in my research. Probably more that I missed. Because that's how this works. That's how Oda builds. Not with tricks or with retroactive justifications, but with genuine long-term planning. The kind of planning that takes decades and requires holding every thread simultaneously and knowing where each one leads before it gets there. And the result is a villain whose reveal feels like a reminder rather than a surprise. Because you've already met him. You just didn't know it. You met him every time you looked at Mihawk's eyes. You met him every time you saw King's white hair. You met him every time Kaido called himself an Oni. You met him every time the 5 elders appeared in those awakened forms, and you wondered what was above them. You were meeting Imu the whole time, in pieces, scattered across the world, waiting to be assembled. And now chapter 1179 assembled them. And the picture is terrifying and wonderful. And exactly as ambitious as a series that has been running for 27 years deserves its final villain to be. One thing that I want to leave you with before we close out today. And it's not about foreshadowing. It's about what the foreshadowing means for the final battle. Joy Boy lost. 800 years ago, Joy Boy gave everything he had, everything his crew had, everything his alliance had, and it wasn't enough. The world Imu built has existed for 8 centuries because Joy Boy couldn't tear it down. And the tragedy of that, the specific tragedy, is that Joy Boy wasn't weak. He wasn't wrong. He wasn't insufficient in terms of who he was. He was too early. The world wasn't ready. The allies weren't enough. The stars weren't aligned. Luffy is the return of Joy Boy. But Luffy has something Joy Boy didn't have. 27 arcs worth of friends. Every kingdom the Straw Hats have touched. Every person who said, "I'll follow that flag." The Grand Fleet. The Giants of Elbaf. The Revolutionary Army. The freed slaves of Fishman Island, the samurai and minks and ninja of Wano. Every single human connection that the series has been building and cataloguing since the first chapter of One Piece is converging on this moment, on this confrontation, on this final encounter between the heir of Joy Boy and the person Joy Boy couldn't defeat 800 years ago. The foreshadowing of Imu was scattered across 27 years of manga. But the foreshadowing of Luffy's victory has been scattered across every single person he's ever met who decided to stand up because of him. The entire series is the foreshadowing of what happens next. Oda didn't just hide Imu's design in the chapters. He hid the solution to Imu in the relationships, in the bonds, in the unbreakable faith of every person who ever said Luffy will make it. Every person who looked at the drums of liberation and felt their heart lift against their will. Joy Boy promised. Joy Boy failed. And the world has been waiting 800 years for the one who would arrive at the appointed time. Not to make the same promises, to fulfill them. Luffy is at Elbaf. The drums are sounding. It's time. This has been Anime Autopsy. We found every piece of foreshadowing of Imu's true form. Oda drew it years ago, and now, finally, we all see it. Thank you for watching this far, genuinely, because that was a lot, and you stayed for all of it, and that means everything. Drop in the comments what hit hardest for you, and if you want more of this, you know what to do. I'll see you for the next one. Actually, hold on. I want to come back to one thing before we really close out, because I've been sitting here thinking about it, and I think it's too important to leave on the table. The Mother Flame. We need to talk about the Mother Flame and how it fits into everything we've been discussing today. Because Chapter 1179 showed us something very specific. York at Mary Geoise, working on the Mother Flame under extreme pressure from Garling, who is now the new warrior god of science following Saturn's retirement. And the framing of that York scene in the same chapter as Imu's appearance at Elbaf is very deliberate. Oda is cutting between two things happening simultaneously. Imu bleeding and transforming at Elbaf, and York working frantically on the Mother Flame at Mary Geoise. That parallel editing is Oda telling you these two things are connected. The Mother Flame matters to Imu in some specific way that the same chapter as his full reveal chose to foreground. And I think, going back to the Lunarian law, the connection might be exactly what we discussed earlier. The Lunarians could create fire, the flames on their backs. Their bodies produce flame as a natural biological function, and King, throughout his arc, used that flame to devastating effect. It's one of the defining aspects of the Lunarian racial power set. Imu has white hair and dark skin. Imu has wings, in the awakened form. But where is the flame? Where is the biological fire that a Lunarian should have? We see the flames around the spear, the dark abyssal fire. But we don't see the clean back flame that King carries. We don't see the natural Lunarian fire as a constant element of Imu's visible design in the way it is for King. And that absence might be the point. It might be the specific vulnerability, the flame that was taken from him, or the flame that he lost, or the flame that requires the Mother Flame as an external power source to replicate now that his own natural version is gone. The Lunarian fire that Imu lost somewhere in the 800 years, or in the Void Century battle, or in the moment of his own corruption, is the missing piece that York is frantically working to replace. If that's true, then Luffy doesn't just need to defeat Imu in combat. He needs to either destroy the Mother Flame before it can be used, cutting off Imu's access to his full power, or he needs to be in place to fight Imu before that power is restored. The clock that Chapter 1179 is setting isn't just narrative urgency. It's a mechanical countdown. York finishes the Mother Flame. Imu becomes something even more complete than what we saw in Chapter 1179. The bleeding, the strain, the vulnerability of being at Elbaf rather than Mary Geoise, all of that gets nullified. So the race isn't just Luffy versus Imu. It's Luffy and everyone at Elbaf versus Imu, with the handicap of Imu's current weakness, against a ticking clock that ends when York finishes the Mother Flame, and Imu's full power is potentially restored. That's the structure of the final arc. And it's been foreshadowed not just by the design elements we've spent this video analysing, but by the specific scene choices Oda made in Chapter 1, 1179 itself. He told you the stakes in the same chapter that revealed the villain. The foreshadowing doesn't stop at the reveal. It continues into the setup of the final battle's mechanics. Because Oda is playing this not as a climax, but as an ongoing construction. The reveal of Imu is not the end of the mystery. It's the moment when the mystery becomes a countdown. And that's kind of the most exciting thing about where One Piece is right now. The person we've been waiting to understand for 8 years has been revealed. And the understanding of who Imu is makes the urgency of what comes next feel completely real in a way it didn't before. Because now we know what Luffy is running toward. Now we know what Joy Boy couldn't defeat 800 years ago. Now we know exactly what the drums of liberation are in opposition to. And Luffy doesn't know any of this. Luffy doesn't know about the foreshadowing. Luffy doesn't know about the ringed eye connection to Mihawk. Luffy doesn't know about the Lunarian racial template. Luffy just knows that somewhere on this island there's someone who hurt Vivi and erased Lelouch and has been the shadow behind every terrible thing the world government has ever done. And Luffy is going to find that person and punch them in the face with every bit of Joy Boy's stored haki and his own absolute stubborn refusal to let the world stay the way it is. That's the beauty of One Piece. The analysis and the emotion aren't in conflict. You can trace every piece of foreshadowing and understand the intellectual construction of the story, and also be completely, unreservedly invested in Luffy, just wanting to be free and wanting everyone else to be free too. The head and the heart of this story point at the same place. They always have. That's what Oda built. 27 years, 1179 chapters, and every single one of them was pointing here. I'll see you next time.